In this video, I'm going to be doing question 4 and question 5 from module B2. I'm going to be using the Excel file asiaphoria underscore rates underscore PWT underscore 80. You'll notice that I have 3 additional worksheets in my Excel file. That's because I've already typed out interpretations in those files. Don't worry about those. We'll be creating those worksheets together. In the previous question, question 3a, we saw that high growth rate in the 90s was not a good predictor of high growth rate in the 2000s. In question 4, we're asked to consider a subset of this data. So the first question, question 4a, asks us to consider only OECD member nations. In other words, for countries that are a member of the OECD, is high growth rate in the 90s a good predictor of high growth rate in the 2000s? In order to do this, I need to filter my data. So we'll notice in column C that we have a dummy variable, OECD, that's equal to 1 if the country is a member of the OECD, and equal to 0 if the country is not a member of the OECD. In order to filter our data, we just want to click in any individual cell in our worksheet. So anywhere where there's data, I've selected cell A1, and then I want to go to the Data tab at the top and click on the funnel for filter. So you should have a drop-down menu that appears under each column title. And we can click on OECD and filter out the 0. So just uncheck 0 to select only countries that are a member of the OECD. Remember that whenever we filter data, we do not want to work in this worksheet. This becomes especially important for Excel files such as this one, where when we filter the data, you'll notice that the rows are no longer in order. So it goes 6, 7, and then 12. If we were to run a regression in this worksheet, it would still consider the rows that are just hidden. So we want to copy all of this data. So I click on A and drag my mouse over to the last column and copy this data into a new worksheet. I've already created this worksheet and titled it OECD. So let's paste the data into our new worksheet. And now we can run the regression. I'm going to run the regression using Data Analysis Toolpath. So I want to go to the Data tab at the top, and then in the far right-hand corner, Data Analysis. And let's choose Regression. So whenever we're running regressions using Data Analysis Toolpath, we can only select just the data, not the entire column. So I'm going to click on J1, Command-Shift down arrow key. And then for the X range, it's going to be growth rate in the 90s. So I'll click on I1, Command-Shift down arrow key. Recall that I always recommend selecting labels, and that's to make our output easier to read, which is going to be especially important once we get to multiple regression. So select labels, since we've selected both J1 and I1. If you were not to select the labels and you were to start with row 2, make sure that labels was not selected. And my output range, I'm going to choose it to be Q1. Press OK. So this question asks us to look at R squared, which is right here. So let's highlight R squared. So this is a very low R squared. It's only 14.6%, which means only 14.6% of the variation across growth rates in the 2000s is explained by growth rates in the 90s for OECD member nations. Remember the R squared we got in the previous part was as 5.6%. So for OECD member nations, growth rate in the 90s explains more of the variation in growth rate in the 2000s. However, 14.6% is still very small. Clearly, growth rate in the 90s is not capturing a lot of the variation or explaining a lot of the variation in the growth rate in the 2000s. This question also asks us to find the slope coefficient, which is right here, and it's equal to 0.281. So in this case, we would say that on average, OECD member nations with an additional 1 percentage point of growth in the 90s only had an additional 0.28 percentage points of growth in the 2000s. So less than a third of the growth carries over. In comparison to when we did all of the data, we got 0.2, so it is more of the growth carrying over. However, it's still very minimal. The next question, question 4b, asks us to consider non-OECD member nations. So let's go back to our original data, and I'm going to filter it for non-OECD members. So let's go back to the filter that's still here on column C. And this time, let's click on 0 and then click on 1. So now we only have non-OECD members. And let's copy this data into a new worksheet. Copy. And I've already created the worksheet and titled it non-OECD, which is where I'm going to paste my data. And now we can run a regression. There's actually more countries in non-OECD members than OECD members, so we will have to adjust our data range. Let's go to the Data tab at the top and back to Data Analysis Toolpack and click on Regression. So our Y range is still the growth rate in the 2000s, so we click on J1, Command-Shift down arrow key. This time we have 113 countries. And our X range is going to be the growth rate in the 90s. Command-Shift down arrow key for column I. Once again, make sure we have labels selected. And I'm going to leave my output range as Q1. Press OK. So our R squared is lower this time. In this case, we would say that only 7.9% of the variation across growth rates in the 2000s is explained by variation in growth rates in the 90s in non-OECD member nations. So in comparison to OECD member nations, less of the growth rates in the 2000s is explained by the growth rate in the 90s. However, compared to all of our data where it was just 5.6%, clearly there is similarities between growth rates in non-OECD member nations just specifically and only OECD member nations, but it's very small. And then here we have our slope, 2.36. So on average, OECD member nations with an additional 1 percentage point of growth in the 90s only had an additional 0.24 percentage points of growth in the 2000s. So approximately 1/4 of the growth carries over. So even less than an OECD member nations, but again, there are similarities between just OECD members and non-OECD members. The next question, question 5, asks us to compare the growth rate in the 2000s between OECD member nations versus non-OECD member nations. In order to do this, we can either calculate the average growth rate in the 2000s for just OECD member nations and the average growth rate in the 2000s for non-OECD member nations, or we can run a regression, which is what we're going to do for this question. So if you're asked to do this on a test, this would be one way you could calculate both the growth rates at the same time. So let's go back to our original data and unfilter it. So in order to do this, just click on any cell, go to the Data tab, and then click on Filter. I'm going to put this data into a new worksheet. So I'm going to copy column C by clicking on C. And I also need the growth rates in the 2000s. So while holding the Command key, I'm going to click on J. That way, both of my columns are selected together. And I'm going to copy those and paste them into a new worksheet that I've already created and labeled OECD versus non-OECD. So let's go ahead and paste this into a new worksheet. In order to create a scatter plot, remember that we need our X variable first and our Y variable second, which is what we have. Scatter plots work if we select both the columns as a chunk. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Just click on A and drag over to B and go to the Insert tab and click on Scatter Plot. We want the first one. So here we have all of the growth rates for our non-OECD member nations. That's when OECD equals 0, all lined up right here. And over here, we can see all of the growth rates for OECD member nations. In order to run a regression, we want to click on our scatter plot and go to Chart Design. And then in the far left-hand corner under Add Chart Elements, I want to insert a trend line. Let's insert a linear trend line and double click on this trend line to insert the equation. And we want to display equation, and we can also display R squared. Once we do this, you can drag it, and you can also make it larger, which is optional. I'm going to do this so it's easier to read. In this case, our intercept 0.029 represents the average growth rate for non-OECD member countries. So we can say for the cross-section of 142 countries with sufficient annual real GDP per capita data in the PWT 8.2 database between 2000 and 2010, on average, real GDP per capita grew annually at 2.9% for non-OECD member nations. Remember, this is the average growth rate, so it's measured as a percent, which is what we see here. And the first part just tells us where this data comes from, which is really important whenever you're doing an interpretation. Our slope coefficient, negative 0.015, tells us the difference between the average growth rate for OECD member nations and non-OECD member nations. So in order to get the average growth rate for OECD member nations in the year 2000, we just have to add the slope to our intercept. So in this case, it's negative 0.029 and minus 0.015. And we can say that for OECD member nations, real GDP per capita grew at 1.4%. So that's 1.5 percentage points slower than non-OECD countries. Remember that negative 0.015 is the difference between 2%. So that's measured as a percentage point difference, whereas 0.029 represents the average growth rate for non-OECD members. So that is a percent. Also notice the difference in the scatter. So for non-OECD member nations, there's clearly a much larger variation in the growth rates compared to OECD members that all have a very similar growth rate. This is not surprising, as the OECD is an organization that gathers fairly similar developed nations. And we also saw that in the previous part, where the R squared was higher for just OECD member nations.